And this is on a gallery view, right?
Mm,
Okay, we're live, it seems like.
yeah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to everyone who's viewing Milestones webinar today. My name is Isra Ibrahim. I'm a student and an organizer based in South Florida, and I also work and organize with Milestones as a media analyst and whatnot. Inshallah, today I will be your moderator for today's roundtable. And I want to quickly introduce our guest today. We have a familiar face, Brother Tanzeen Doha, who is the general editor for Milestones. Always great to have him here. And we also have a guest panelist, Brother Ali Harfouch, who is a Lebanese-based analyst and researcher of Muslim politics. So Jazakallah khair for the both of you guys for being here today.
Oh, yeah.
That's what happened. Assalamu
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So inshallah, to start, just kind of a brief overview of what we want to discuss. We'll be discussing the social and political aftermath of the Beirut explosion, the implications for the various political actors within the region, within Lebanon's political landscape and abroad. And we will also kind of discuss Israel and UAE relations in light of the August 2020 deal that was brokered by the US. And finally, we want to get into deconstructing like popular narratives of the events that have been happening and the implications for Islamism and the region. So it's a lot to get to here today, and we have like a specific time. So if you guys have questions, we'll try to get to them if we can, inshallah. So I guess my first question to start it off would be for Brother Ali Harfouch. Given that the Beirut explosion just happened a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to ask you, what is the geopolitical significance of the explosion?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure, especially to be with Brother Tanzeen, to share the platform with Brother Tanzeen. So, I mean, the Beirut explosion definitely does have actually significant geopolitical implications, uh, namely in that it puts Lebanon back on the scene as a geopolitical center, as a strategic geopolitical center in the Middle East. In the past years, Lebanon as a geopolitical center, as a political space, was overshadowed with the events in Syria, right? So basically, Lebanon was associated with whatever was happening in Syria, and basically whatever flows out from Syria. Now, the Beirut explosion and then the French intervention and the French attempts to leverage that explosion puts Lebanon back in the spotlight in terms of regional politics and disputes.
Okay, Sean. And just to kind of go off of that, given that Lebanon right now is on the international scene, what would you say would be the geopolitical significance of Lebanon in the Muslim world? And you can kind of give like a short, comparison and contrast of within the past few years and today.
Okay, that's a very good question, because Lebanon, in many ways, has key strategic, symbolic, media, and geopolitical significance in the Muslim world, right? Symbolic and intellectual in the sense that it's always been considered a bastion for Westernization and for colonial thought, right? So you had key colonial institutions and secular Arab movements beginning in Lebanon and then spreading outwards, like the Ba'ath movement, the Arab Communist movement, the Arab left, and to some extent, to a large extent, the Palestinian nationalist movements that were at one point headquartered in Lebanon. So that's the significance in terms of Lebanon as a symbolic and intellectual landscape space. Politically, right, Lebanon has always been a pantheon for regional powers, right, for the struggles between regional powers. So it kind of mirrors the struggle between, or the contestation between, let's say, the United States and the European powers, or between earlier, in previous decades, between the French and between the British. So in that sense, what happens in Lebanon doesn't stay in Lebanon, right? It has a regional impact. Um, and I think this is one of the things that we noticed when the protests happened in Lebanon, that it had quite a significant impact on Muslims in the Muslim world who were watching this, right? Who were watching what was viewed as a eternal regime beginning to crumble, if only at the symbolic level. So that's one of the reasons why I think Lebanon plays a key strategic role, and it will mirror the present condition of the Muslim world and what are some of the potential futures that we can anticipate.
That's really interesting. And also, like before, you had mentioned about the French intervention, and also right now, your current comment about how Lebanon operates as a space for like Westernization, and for like, you know, the expanding of that kind of. So with that in mind, regarding Macron's overt intervention following the explosion in Lebanon, what are some of the implications of that for the main power brokers?
So now Macron's intervention, first of all, is, you know, first and foremost, is nothing new, right? So it's much bigger than Macron. The issue is with France as a international power and as a forefront of European hegemony or ex-hegemony, let's say, in the Middle East. So the French intervention in Lebanon began far before, you know, Macron came onto the scene. Begins in 1860 up until now. So the French have always been invested in trying to mediate power or mediate change in Lebanon. So, for example, you had the relationship between Jacques Chirac, the previous president, late former president, and Rafiq al-Hariri, who was leading the Sunni bloc. And then you had Nicolas Sarkozy and his relationship to Michel Suleiman, the former president. And then now you have Macron, who prior to the Beirut explosion was brokering deals between the Sunni bloc and Saudi Arabia, right? And he was bolstering the Sunni bloc that is responsible for much of the corruption in Lebanon. And now he's claiming to represent an independent political bloc that began to emerge after the protests. So the French role in Lebanon is you know, very old, and it has always been, to a large extent, destructive and, of course, opportunistic. In fact, sectarian strife began in the 1860s as a result of French and British, Russian competition over Mount Lebanon, with some of them supporting the Maronites, some supporting the Orthodox Christians, and then supporting the Druze. Then, of course, the French mandate and the founding of the Lebanese state that was described by one French official as a form of Lebanese Zionism, or trying to, and the very absurdity of the idea, which the French followed through with, the Day of Lebanon, was also described by the French at one point as trying to square a circle. So I think France's you know, role in Lebanon predates Macron. Now, with regards to what it means for other power brokers, I think to some extent the French might be trying to leverage more control over Lebanon in the wake of Donald Trump's administration's burning bridges between Washington and Beirut. So, for example, Macron is on the scene saying that, look, we have to recognize Hezbollah's role in Lebanese politics and their place in the political landscape. And so they're kind of giving a more moderate and more mediatory proposal that representing Europe and that of the United States. So you can kind of say that now there are two competing political projects: that of the United States in Lebanon, which wants to a large extent, you know, inhibit Hezbollah's influence on the ground. Then you have the more moderate French approach, which is far more pragmatic and opportunistic. Lastly, on this particular topic, also something which is very interesting is the French use of soft power. If you look at the discourse that is being employed by Macron and some of the people that some of the things that he has been saying and the type of figures that he has visited, we find that the French are not so much invested in economic leverage, but more so in terms of soft power, right? Trying to leverage the existing anti-government sentiments in such a way as to have a French foothold in Lebanon, or larger French foothold in Lebanon.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Yeah, so I want to kind of discuss more of the kind of the political actors within the wider region, and also the implications and role of Islamism in all of this. So if you could give an overview of the sectarian landscape in Lebanon, its origins and elements, and the different sects thereof.
Mm-hmm. So this is actually perhaps one of the most misunderstood topics. The issue of sectarianism in Lebanon and the roots of sectarianism in Lebanon and whatnot. Now, the mainstream narrative, right, is that sectarianism and civil strife is the product of corrupt political politicians that are opportunistic and so forth. But the reality is that the sectarian violence and sectarian discourse is far more systemic, and it is actually based and rooted in the idea of Lebanon as a nation state. So that is why, you know, sectarian strife and discourse and the very category of the sect emerged with the emergence of the Lebanese nation state, which again at one point was referred to as a form of Lebanese nationalism. So sectarianism is a consequence of the idea of Lebanon, the idea of a Lebanese nation state. And you know, beginning in 1860 up until you know, the founding of the Lebanese state um, up until the present. So the very category of the sect as a political identity is the product of a modern political architecture. It is not the product of ancient, you know, strife between competing religions in the region, because at the time of the Ottomans, prior to French intervention and British intervention into Mount Lebanon, there was a coexistence between the different millet, the millet system and whatnot. So in order to understand sectarianism in Lebanon, you have to understand the history of the idea of Lebanon, the idea of a Lebanese nation, and consequently the Constitutional Democratic Republic of Lebanon, which perpetuates sectarianism rather than quelling or mediating sectarianism.
Mm. So specifically for that, regarding what you just kind of stated, what would you think would be the implications for like the role of Islamism in Lebanon, for example, pre and post the Syrian revolution? And if you can specifically speak a little bit towards Hezbollah on this.
Mm-hmm. So the Islamists in Lebanon have always had their presence, right? Especially in Beirut and in Tripoli, mainly because, you know, Lebanon borders Syria. So in Syria, you had the Muslim Brotherhood, which was being led by Muslim Sibai, who in turn came to Lebanon and established his own branch of Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. And then in Tripoli, you had a very strong presence for the Salafis, who at one point actually seized Tripoli and had their own small Islamic Emirat for a period of 2 to 3 years. So Islamists have always had a presence in Lebanon. The question was, what was their relationship to the political landscape? So you generally have two types of movements. Movements that retain a sense of autonomy from the political landscape, and by that I mean the idea of Lebanon as a nation state and of, you know, the parliamentary sectarian system. And then those who decided to enter the political landscape and recognize the idea of Lebanon as being a legitimate nation and recognize its sectarian makeup. So the Muslim Brotherhood, early into, as early as the 1950s, became heavily invested in the sectarian landscape, and that is why the Brotherhood largely appealed to the Sunnis in Lebanon in terms of their participation in parliamentary elections and so forth. Similarly, Hezbollah, prior in 1982, right? It was founded when it was founded in 1982. For a period of time, it maintained its a sort of revolutionary discourse, a discourse of autonomy, not really recognizing Lebanon as being an independent, autonomous nation state, but overtly showing their allegiance to the Iranian project of Wilayat al-Faqih and espousing this revolutionary doctrine. And you can see this in the literature after 1982 and in the speeches, right, that were made by the leaders of Hezbollah at that time. Now, fast forward to early 1990s, Hezbollah entered parliament and essentially declared itself part of the sectarian landscape and part of the political part of the parliament. And despite that, they still had popular support for one reason, and one reason only, which is because they were representing the resistance and they were fighting Israel south of Lebanon. But this all came to an abrupt end after their intervention into Syria, which kind of cemented them as a sectarian group that can appeal to one segment of the population, and that being the Shia population, rather than appealing to the broader Muslim world or to the Sunni bloc.
So to kind of to follow up on this, and Tanzeen also, if you have a point to add to this, what do you make of the call for like a secular and civil state by civil society activists in Lebanon to be posed as an alternative to Lebanon's sectarian political landscape?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, so for the past 10 years, you know, these progressive civil rights activists, movement leaders, academics, think tanks, and so forth, you know, I've sat with many of them, I've debated many of them, discussed these issues with many of them. There's a very superficial understanding as to what a secular state is and what a civil state is for these progressives, right? Many of which are very much aligned with the liberal project and the new liberalization of Lebanon, not to mention their ties with certain embassies and projects such as USAID and so forth. Now, the irony is that Lebanon was already a secular state. So sectarianism is not antithetical or a deviation from the secular state. It is a product of the secular state. It is a product of the secular state's attempt to mediate and to create categories, the category of religion and its role in society. So this is one thing I think that still, you know, I mean, this is becoming increasingly recognized, at least in academia in the West, but in Lebanon, you know, the idea that Lebanon is not a sectarian state stems from the hegemony of the idea of the secular that it has over the mind of these civil rights activists. And if you look at, you know, some of the research that was done by Osama Maqdisi, who I think he's a professor of history at Princeton, his book called Culture of Sectarianism traces, or the works of Sabah Mahmoud or Hussein Ali Agrama and Talal Asad, traces back the idea of the sect and the idea of mediating religion and creating categories of religion with the secular state and the project of the secular state. So it's a very paradoxical call, the idea of a civil state and a secular state for Lebanon, because Lebanon is and always has been a secular state, but a secularism that is domesticated to fit you know, the context of Lebanon's sects.
No, thank you so much for that. I want to open it up. I want to open this discussion a little bit more towards the UAE and Israeli relations, and specifically Tanzeen, if you can comment on Adi's last point about, I guess, the civil state and the secular. I know you've been discussing that a lot in your work, particularly here in the West, but also as like a second question, kind of giving us an overview of like, what is your take on the UAE and Israel deal in terms of what it means for Palestine and for broader Islamist struggles?
It's great to be on the same panel with Ali Harfous, one of the brothers I deeply love and care about, inshallah.
Likewise.
And Isra, thank you for moderating this conversation. I would like to actually go back to the point that Ali was making, which is really important, which is the necessary paradox of the secular state is the question of sectarianism. So the secular state requires sectarianism. It doesn't require the opposite of that, even though that's the ideological fascination, that once you have a secular state, you would have this kind of democratic tolerance or a civil society in which people would be good with each other, etc. You would create a society based on secular values. The other point that Ali made, which is concretely important, is that Islamist groups actually go through a process of secularization themselves once they begin to participate in the sets of assumptions that secularism has. So when we're seeing distinctly Hezbollah's sectarian engagement in Syria very openly, the only thing they kept on using as a justification was their so-called anti-Wahhabism, but they continuously engaged in the kind of atrocities and war that were actually not considered okay by the original kind of utterances of, let's say, 79 Iran, in which Ayatollah Khomeini had particularly outlined. So whether I, as a Sunni, disagree with the Iranian model is a different issue. It's a Aqidah question. But we see a deep secularization. We have to openly call it that. And it will come up in our conversation about the UAE, Israel, and what that means for groups like Hamas as well, is that Islamism has to now begin to think about the deep connection that entrapment in secularism and what it means that you can have the appearance of Islamism, but at the contingent level of history, the concrete and historical level, that there is a secularization that you're not only simply trapped in, but you're actually participating in quite directly. So always the justifications are practical. And this is where I would encourage our followers of Milestones, at least, to move beyond kind of the Muslim Western civil society discourse, which tends to be all about an internal contestation within the secular state between autocracy and democracy. This is not the main question. The main question is much bigger than that. The main question is the incompatibility of modern state form, whether that state form is a democratic republic, whether that state form is a kingdom, these are all state forms. And the primary problem between that state form being incompatible with the system of order that Islam prescribes. And so what does it mean for Muslims to be in that crisis? This is a very important question. There are anthropologists like Noah Solomon and stuff who worked on showing the inspiration of Islam, even in this modern sort of state building processes. And that's really significant and important, his work on Sudan, for example. But I would like to really explain that. The second point that I would like to highlight about the Lebanese explosion is, Professor Laleh Khalili wrote a very short piece. It did not cover all the details, but it was helpful. And I think Muslims will have to begin to think about capitalism in concrete and historical terms, not simply in sort of like metaphysical terms. Not think about capitalism as, oh, that's another religion. That's not a correct understanding of capital. And anyway, Laleh Khalili talks about maritime capital and its role and its interaction with governance in Lebanon in making this explosion possible. So what is the relationship then between secular governance, Islamist participation in secularism, and capitalism? This is a very important question for Muslims, and we have to understand that question. So, the protests in Lebanon about corruption, the government said those are important protests, but there has to be an analysis at a higher level of abstraction. And so this is something else that is also important. The other point is, as far as I understand, and again, I know that there's propaganda that could be used against certain groups in the region, But this is very important information to know that some of the ports, a lot of the ports, Hezbollah had a lot of control over those ports. So there's two things going on. Inside Hezbollah, there's obviously not a proper assessment and understanding of capitalism. Number two, they're participating in pragmatic logic of the state and their own interest. The chemical weapons, you could say, the chemicals that were there is concerns that those were things that could have been used in the Syrian war, and Hezbollah would have used that potentially and could have used that. These are all major concerns in relation to Syria and that being a neighbor of Lebanon and so on, and then Hezbollah's participation and secularization while maintaining, a Shia but an Islamic appearance and so on. So these are very important things that we have to discuss. And a lot of the Sunni groups go through the same crisis and the same problem of a self-secularization. It's not always this idea of binary opposites of there is that secularism and there is Islam and they're fighting. Actually, inside secularism, inside Islam, there is a secularization happening. It's sort of like, when we think about Orientalism, we don't only think about European Orientalism, we think about self-Orientalism that Arabs can have about themselves. And this is the same thing. So you could have a kind of secularization in the Islamic world that is internal to the Islamic world itself. It's not simply enforced by France. That's the easy debate. That's the easy conversation. We have to have this harder conversation. And the other focus is to think about capitalism, not just of the land, that's easy to talk about, but of the seas, of air. Those are all part of the capitalist systematicity of capital, the larger, the whole globality of the capital and how that works, inshallah. So that's the only things I would add for this. But we could go to the UAE discussion, but Ali might have something he wants to say.
You've covered it brilliantly.
Yes, no, Jazakallah khair Tanzeen for that. Very, very important comments. You briefly mentioned a little bit about this, this wider discourse happening with American Muslims, and how this narrative, this popular narrative that comes up about, when we critique UAE or Israel, it's always a critique about normalization, or about the complicity of certain scholars and whatnot. If you can just kind of speak a little bit to that, why that exists as a popular narrative. So why that exists as a popular narrative, why it continues to persist, and how these people who are making these critiques can also are able to internalize a lot of it as well.
Maybe Ali could jump in, and I'll. And we spoke about normalization before in our personal conversations, Ali. So maybe you could add something. I could jump on it. And
I think so. This question, the question of normalization and the discourse of normalization and anti-normalization, it hits at the heart of what Tanzeen was just talking about, which is this self-secularization or this internalization of secularism. And what I mean by that is that the whole discourse on normalization or anti-normalization begins with the premise and the assumption of the validity of the nation-state system. So this is the first problem, that we already begin with the premise and we begin with the internalization of certain structures of power. And by structures of power, I don't just mean structuring military power or structuring our political horizons, but also structuring the horizons of our thought. And that is what makes power so elusive, when it's able to structure your thought, when it's able to deem some things to be legitimate and some things to be illegitimate, or some things to be possible and some things to be impossible. So I think when we talk about the issue of the Israeli state, we need to take a step back and first look at what are the structures of thought and the structures of power which prevent us from fully understanding the problem of Israel, how to engage with this problem, and even historically speaking, what are the structures that enabled the emergence of the Israeli state. It is the nation state system in the Muslim world. So ironically, when we are the anti-normalization discourse, right? The anti-normalization discourse legitimizes the very same structures that gave birth to Israel in the first place. So that's one of the paradoxes, and that's one of the problems with, in my opinion, with the discourse of anti-normalization. I think we need to step out of that and have a more authentic and genuine discourse that can see beyond the nation state.
Yeah, I would just like to say that one of the problems I think with, again, this normalization conversation is kind of an illusion that it is already not normalized. Things have been normalized since the late 40s.
Yes.
That Israel actually exists, unless we want to look at comical statements made to use Muslim sentiments by some of the Ayatollahs and their friends about how Israel will be destroyed next day. Tomorrow you wake up and Israel will disappear. This is kind of comical. Does that make sense? Because it doesn't actually show us that fact. So, so I want to be very clear about it and everything I'm saying is as an academic here, like as a objectively thinking about things, not my agenda or something like that. But we have to be objective about these things. Now, having said that, of course we have to condemn this treaty. Of course we have to condemn this alliance. Of course we have to understand the details of what happens. What does it mean? Even there, there is a tremendous gap and insensitivity, I would say, in Muslim response to this. Because one of the things that's clearly not discussed is how this alliance and treaty actually harms and affects and negatively impacts a lot of the non-state Islamic movements. No one talks about that because they don't want to touch that. It's very easy and direct to talk about Palestine, and we should, of course. It's going to affect Palestinians in detail, of course. But it's also going to affect, you have to understand what is simplistically called today Salafi jihadism, for example, is coming from actually the Emirati world in many ways, through rebellion inside the elites in many ways. And those networks and connections are going to be deeply impacted and frozen up by these kinds of alliance. This is not a simple matter of, I was reading a renowned analyst in our community whose words are very much taken seriously, and I take it too, dear brother Hatem Bazian. He's talking about how it's all about Iran. This thing is all about countering Iran. I don't think it's only about countering Iran at all. I think it's actually about controlling large-scale ethical and unethical actors of non-state Islam, in which Iran participates also, in which Syria participates also. The prisons and jails in Iran and Syria are filled up, just like in Libya, with jihadi populations. Their source of how they came, right, did not come from the Ikhwanis, did not come from post-Said Qutbist democratic Ikhwanists. They didn't come from that. That tradition also will be a victim of this treaty and this alliance. Very important question. This is also about management of the particular types of Syrian rebellion. Very important. So we have to understand how Muslims have internalized a kind of anti-Wahhabism as well. In the name of a blanket anti-Wahhabism, they've forgotten the details and nuances and the complexities of rebellions that came out of the Emirati world, the world of the Gulf. It cannot be ignored. Last 30 years was not a joke. People fought in various capacities. And they themselves were fighting against the unethical Wahhabists. Very important. These are the nuances and details that Muslims have to understand. Secondarily, when it comes to the question of secularization, you know, we have to think about like the difference, like Hamas, for example, is very openly has talked about resistance. Now, resistance is a term that we have to understand. It actually comes from the books of Western history, actually. It's allowed to resist when there is a violent occupation. It's never, right? So Palestinians have encouraged a discourse of resistance. It was never a discourse of terrorism, for example. Why? Because the second thing is not lawful, even by Western standards. Yeah, by Western standards, resistance is actually, so Hamas did step by step by step various forms of compensation to show their humane side and fight against colonialism. What did we gain, for example, in the last charter change that Hamas had? That is internal secularization. That is acceptance of a degree of defeat. This is a problem. Why is it that when we look at videos of young teenager Palestinians in West Bank, they're talking about Gaza and Al-Qassam brigades as if those are terrorists. We don't like them either. Why is it that we see sometimes these kinds of footage? Why is it that when we think about national liberation, there are similar assumptions between secular groups who resist and Islamist groups who resist sometimes? That is secularization. There has to be a critique. Why is it that when Hamas refused to directly go up against some of the serious rebellions, that Iran froze their accounts?
100%.
Where were the Ayatollahs then, talking about the destruction of Israel, the entity, the Zionist entity, etc.? This is comical. Has to be taken seriously. We have to discuss this very seriously. Not in an anti-sectarian way, objectively. Objectively, has to be discussed. The Muslim world is much more complicated and complex, and Syria was conceptually unveiled this complexity for us, and we have to pay attention each day, every move about what happens, and therefore understand what this means, right? So some of the questions that we have to deal with, again, of course, it's going to affect the Palestinians. We have to be vigilant. This is about thinking about how Palestine is connected as an Islamic question, right? The experts and analysts will have to begin to now clarify themselves. What are they talking about? Are they talking about Arab nation state fights? Or are they talking about Islam? It's something they have to make a decision, because paradigmatically, this is why I actually question a kind of blanket decolonial discourse, because that also assumes and begins the conversation at the level of the nation state and national liberation, etc. Why is it that Muslim Americans love to see Islamists only when they fight back, but never when they try to form a government? Think about Afghanistan. They hate when the Taliban creates a system of governance. They talk about all kinds of hypocrisy, blah, blah, blah. But when they fight against US, oh yes, because they feel like there's honor in the fight. Why is it that they actually are concerned when the Sharia is enforced? And what kind of state, and this is not my perspective only, but I would say a particular tendency of ethical non-state Islamism have critiqued resistance forces that suggest and only participate in national liberation resistance, even when in the name of Islam, because the assumption is that when they're done with it, they're going to create a society based on pillars of secularism. Very important points. These are important points that we cannot. Now, as far as the other stuff about normalization, I guess we could, I'm going to go wait for the other questions and I'm going to answer that. Maybe I said too many questions, but, and some of my answers are fragments because unfortunately, the Islamic world does not have a very simplistic, and this is my very open, I wouldn't say condemnation, but serious critique of unethical non-state actors, their puritanical and simplistic view about the world. And so that is also something that has to be critiqued. And so we'll discuss that further. But the reason why a lot of these answers are fragments is because the Islamic world has become fragments when it comes to analysis. And it's hard to just give a one blueprint solution that's just, unless it's just comes from a religious zeal, kind of a romantic, kind of dreamy conversation about you're going to wake up tomorrow and the Khilafah will be established, and you're going to put your favorite alternative civil society guy as the head of Khilafah. See what I'm saying? Those are cartoonish conversations. But anyway, inshallah. So I wanted to raise those questions.
No, thank you so much for that. They're very important questions. They're questions that are not brought up, that are not even considered. I know you mentioned, again, Hatem Bazian, and like, this thing with Iran, which again is like a very popular view of like not only like Muslim Americans, but a lot of like Western leftists as well. And in their own way, kind of like them orientalizing kind of like the Muslim world and Islamism at large, when they kind of like, return to this political line of everything that the US, everything that happens there is like anti-Iran and not asking more of these complicated questions, for sure.
And this has a lot to do with Turkey, by the way. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
By the way, I don't want to, this is not dismissing. Brother Hatem wrote very important things.
Yeah.
All I want to say is that if you're going to be critical, don't just only critique the Wahhabis you don't like. You have to also critique Iran's role. You have to also talk about, not just as a moral issue, actually politically analyze that. That's number one. Number two, the other thing is Turkey has to be discussed here. This was also an anti-Turkish move to create this alliance. It was an anti-Erdogan move. So we have to understand that, right? And Turkey recognizes Israel diplomatically, even though, it recognizes it as a state. So what is the difference between, for example, Turkey? There is a difference. There is a difference, not in terms of utterances, but there is actually a difference. They can create certain kinds of pressure on Israel, etc. But these are important conversations. Why regionally now there are these geopolitical divisions happening? Whenever Turkey becomes completely and directly and smoothly okay with Iran, we have a problem. Whenever it goes through a situation where they can also kind of negotiate a third space between the Saudi kingdom and the Iranians, then there is a room for negotiation. So these are important things for Muslims to realize and understand, because internally Erdogan is also fighting against the Gulenists and their conspiracies and various things. So there's all kinds of pressures that we have to take seriously when it comes to this question. Sorry to interrupt.
No. Thank you so much for that. So I want to ask Ali about your perspective about like the events leading to this, the Israeli and UAE relations, and the broader kind of regional and international context as well.
So, I'll start with the obvious, which is that, this is merely a formalization of bilateral relations that had already existed before the declaration of the so-called, declaration of the peace treaty. I think, if I'm going to point out one thing, it would be the changes. What exactly is it that the UAE is trying to do through this peace deal? Now, prior to this, we have, if we look at the landscape of the Muslim world, you have several actors, state actors, that have de facto power on the ground, right? So you have, as Brother Tanzim pointed out, you have Turkey, right? Turkey, especially after the strategic architecture of and thinking of Ahmed Davutoglu and Erdogan, who have established themselves as, again, an actual de facto power, whether it's soft power or military power, for example, in Syria or in dealing with the Kurds, and to some extent in Libya. You have Qatar, which also established itself as a de facto power through its relationship with the Islamist movements. And then you have Iran, which is also a regional power, which cannot be done away with, and which more than often certain powers like the United States requires its mediation, requires its assistance. So, for example, when the United States was striking Afghanistan, they were in need of Iranian support, especially support from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian intelligence, whether it's in terms of pinpointing Taliban leaders or locating figures of Al-Qaeda and so forth. So, and of course, Saudi Arabia, which symbolically is the center of the Muslim world and the heart of and the origin of Wahhabism. Now, UAE is trying to find its place among these actors. It is trying to find its place in a fragmenting GCC, fragmenting Gulf Cooperation Council. And so they made some attempts in Yemen, right, in south of Yemen, and to a large extent, they were not really able to succeed. They tried to do so in Syria, but they were not able to do so because Turkey and Qatar already had a strong foothold in among the Sunni rebels. And they tried to do so in Libya to a small extent, but again, the political landscape had already been carved out, and to a large extent, they were excluded. Now, in terms of relations with Israel, generally the country that was leading these or that was on the forefront of these was Saudi Arabia, right? You had the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which was being led by Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia was seen as being a sort of mediatory power. Riyadh was, that mediatory power between the West and between the Arabs and relations with Israel. So to a large extent, I think what the UAE is trying to do is trying to sidestep Saudi Arabia, sidestep Qatar, sidestep the UAE, Doha and Turkey, and assert itself as a diplomatic and as a brokering power in the region. And this is all ahead of the November elections in the United States. So the way that UAE has set up itself in relation to Israel is in such a way that whether the incoming president is the incumbent Republican Donald Trump or President Joe Biden, the UAE will still have an appeal, right? It will still appeal to the US administration because the peace deal was supported by both the Democrats and the Republicans. So you can say that they're trying to cement themselves or establish a foothold for themselves in the Gulf and in the broader Middle East ahead of the elections and in the wake of a crumbling GCC Gulf.
Oh no, thank you so much for that. So we've actually covered a lot of our discussion. So I want to open the floor for any of the audience viewers to ask their own questions in the comments below. But also I want to open the floor to the two panelists here for any important takes, any important questions you would like for the audience to consider as well. Tanzania, go ahead.
Well, I think there was a question about, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't cover, I was going on my rant or something. But the question of the Sheikh bin Bayer and Sheikh Hamza, there's a whole, all of this conversation about complicity of the ulama, both Western and, in the UAE and things like that. And there's a huge critique happening, criticisms happening in the American Muslim community. One thing that, to me, again, to go back to the question, of course, the critique should be there. But, we've been critiquing Hamza Yusuf for at least 20 plus years. And so now, none of this is surprising. None of this is strange. None of this is different. And every time we have to condemn, this is not just that, it's not just boring that is expected, but one of the problems with a lot of the criticisms I've noticed is that, of course, it should be critiqued, but it's never actually fully a critique of the state. It's always a critique of which ulama sides with autocrats. Mm-hmm. When the ulama sides with, so what they're doing is they're not critiquing the state. They're not critiquing the state form. They're critiquing autocrats because they want to see democratic ulama to be more present. So I find this critique to be not proper and not full. And we can see that, when we see articles that actually select specific people, when there are other people that the author is close with, they're not selecting them, or if that particular ulama that they like is a democratic one. See? So this is, but they're both pro-state. They're pro-particular states. See what I'm saying? They don't have a critique of the state's problem with Islam. They only have a critique of a kingdom, an autocrat, but they don't, a dictator. You know, Omar Suleiman won't meet Erdogan because he's a dictator. I'm not going to see you. I'm going to take a position, right? He came to New York. He didn't want to see him. So even when Erdogan is dealing with conspirators and Gulenist propagandists in his own state, even that is unacceptable to some of these folks. So basically, what are they looking for? They're looking for Western, soft, sugary liberalism. And when that's not there, they're being highly critical. And they're interested in finding receipts about this and that. And this is why I don't find it very good, because it really actually, in a way, that kind of criticism, not just that it's incomplete, it misleads us into taking our focus away from the state form towards a particular style of governance within that state form, which they want to support. And this is why I wanted to suggest that this is not a very good criticism. We should be critical of different domains and areas in which these kinds of ulama participate in the modern state form in specific ways that actually directly participate in the war on terror, which affects and injures millions of Muslims worldwide. We need to think about that. It actually, democratic states are engaged in the war on terror, in engineering it, in conducting it, in the entire procedure, the entire apparatus is engaged in that war. So why do we have to do this comparison? Why is this the focus of Islamic studies scholars only, mainly, right? There are all these experimental and, so-called thought-provoking books about compatibility between liberalism and Islam, for example. See, and then calling the Islamists who fight against it as simplistic and not really careful, and they don't have enough knowledge, etc. They have an intellectual failure. Very, very, I find this very problematic and shallow and harmful, to be honest. And this is something and the reason why I'm saying this is, as an anthropologist, this is not my critique. This is what I heard on the ground from many serious Islamic practitioners who come from various tendencies.
So, I mean, just to comment on...
Yeah, that's a very important, very important take. A lot of these kind of popular critiques about certain ulama, I mean, you can always read between the lines about there's like this unintelligent kind of quiet assumption that somehow a lot of these scholars that are, actively participating, like not even quietly, but actively participating in a lot of different groups and organizations, not just like with government, just like with soft power, that they're somehow like kind of outside of, participating in a war on terror, outside of like a certain political economy. I'm gonna go to Ali to kind of comment on this as well.
So, I mean, let me tell you something. Brother Tenzin pointed out, we shouldn't give much significance to Ben Bayya and Hamza Yusuf's position on Gaza and on Palestine and on normalization, precisely because he is already setting himself up for failure and compromise by being part of the intellectual regime and the political regime of the nation state. So that's the first thing. We should not be surprised. The second thing, and I'll tell you this as someone, who was living in the Muslim world and, who's been to the Palestinian refugee camps and was engaged with Palestinians, not those living in the West, but, those in proximity to Palestine, is the simple fact, and I want Muslims to know this, especially Muslims in the West, that Gaza Al-Aqsa and Palestine does not need Hamza Yusuf. It does not need Sheikh bin Bayya. It does not need them, and it will never need them. So, I mean, and you know, when we deal with political analysis, we don't just deal with, you know, what comes to us from Financial Times and whatnot. We also deal with what the Prophet ﷺ told us. And we know that the Prophet, when he was talking about the people of Bayt al-Maqdis, the people of Palestine, he said that, you know, there will remain a group from my ummah who remain steadfast upon the haqq, and they will not be disheartened. They will not be disheartened or wavered by those who abandon them and those who oppose them. So the Prophet spoke of two groups: those who oppose them, which refers to you know, whether it's the IDF or U.S. military intervention and so forth. But the Prophet also said, and those who abandon them, وَمَنْ خَذَلَهُمْ. And خَذَلَهُمْ, abandon in Arabic, right, implies that this refers to a group who in origin ought to have supported them and ought to have extended support to them, right? And this refers to who? This refers to the Muslims, and particularly its ulama. So the Prophet told us that, listen, there will be a group of people who oppose you, right? Militarily, politically, economically, and there will be a group of people who you expect them to aid you and you expect their support, but they will abandon you, but not be disheartened by them, because the promise and you know, faith, the victory of Allah comes regardless of their betrayal and their cowardice and whatnot. So I don't think we should give this issue much significance, you know, Hamza and Ben Bayya.
Oh, thank you so much for that. If you guys have any other closing comments or takes, perhaps maybe just questions that you would want the audience to kind of consider, things for them to read up on, because I know for a lot of people, and also just kind of personally for myself, kind of for political self-development, when it comes to kind of the Muslim world, I think kind of living in the West, we kind of have like a lot of politically unintelligent education and analysis, and a lot of activism that goes in a lot of these circles. So if there are comments or questions or even resources that you would encourage our audience to kind of go to after this, you can go ahead and just share some of them.
Ali.
There's a lot of good stuff. This is a difficult question.
It is.
There's a lot of good things. You know what I can do is on Twitter, I'll make a reading list, a geopolitics reading list, inshallah. I'll give you my Twitter account here in the group. But I would say, for starters, there's a very good text that talks about the issue of international relations and Islam, the nation state, and that is a book called Islam and the Political by Amr Sabit. It was published by Plural Press. So that's one book that immediately comes to mind in terms of a beginner's introduction to the issue of Islam and the nation state. There's also by Stephen Kressner, I believe, Sovereignty, Organized Hypocrisy, which kind of tackles the idea and the futility of the idea of sovereignty and nation state. And Tamim al-Barghouti, who, by the way, is not just a poet, but also a brilliant academic. He has a book called The Ummah and the Dawla by Plural Press, and I also recommend that. So I'd recommend those three texts as an introduction to the issue of Islam and international relations and the whole nation-state paradox.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll make sure to find the reading list on Twitter and maybe post it in the comments below, inshallah, for anyone who's interested. Also, Tanzeen, if you had anything to add as well.
I actually just encourage Muslims to understand the state form and to read up on that. And I want them to read up on Carl Schmitt to understand friend-enemy distinction.
Yes.
I want them to understand Marx's Capital Volume 3 and Grundrisse to understand capitalist crisis. Again, this is not a book issue. It's a question of what concerns and understanding. Yeah. This is not an academic thing, because when I was in Bangladesh as a researcher, people are really sharp, and that's where I learned my Hegel, actually. It was not the university necessarily. It helped me, but So I think, I have a strong faith in Muslims in the South because they're very good readers and excellent readers. So these are probably recommendations for Western Muslims. Um, but one of the things is to understand. When I was talking about the state form, is to not easily go into a kind of unintelligent moral anarchism, which a lot of Western Muslims do. They just think about it anti-state immediately without thinking about how the state works. That's also a very flawed way of thinking. And so, yeah, those are some of the things I would say. Tal al-Assad's Formations of the Secular is a very important text in which there is a conversation about he differentiates between nationalism, third world nationalism, and Islamism. The projects are very different.
Yeah.
Of course, we're milestones. Read up on Said Qutb and his tafsir in the shade of the Quran. I think is extremely helpful.
100%.
It's so much rigor. And one of the reasons why, again, this is something I want to encourage. You might hear very important scholars in the West who are Muslim, I respect them very much, critiquing 20th century Islamism in a very sweeping way. I encourage my dear brothers and sisters to actually take 20th century Islamist thought, Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, Abdullah Hazm, and others, very, very seriously, not just for their action, but actually their intellectual works. It has been misrepresented as not detailed and complex, and that's the fault of Western readers and westernized, Westoxified, secularized readers. I would encourage them to think about the nuance. Even when I pick up a book that was published just a few years ago about the poetry of the Taliban, you can see there how rich and the texture in the poems by these fighters in their day-to-day life. I want Muslims to think about the Ummah, to begin to think about the people that maybe have been dismissed as not modern enough or something like that, that there's a lot going on there at the level of living your life according to the Sharia. It's not just about militarily what Islamists have done, it's also intellectually the contribution that they've provided. And so, inshallah, that's just the attitude I encourage, inshallah. That makes sense.
Yes, 100%.
Yes, so Jazakallah khair to all of you who have who's are currently viewing this webinar. I'll make sure to add the reading list that was mentioned here in the comments later. I really want to thank the both of you, Brother Ali and Brother Tanzeen, for this conversation. It was very, very rich, even for me. And I hope, inshallah, like a lot of Muslims, they tune in and think about these questions about Islamism, taking them seriously, and really taking the Sharia seriously. Like, what does it mean to live by the Sharia? Like, not just, again, just as an intellectual, project, but like as a politic, really as a kind of a way of life and whatnot. So, Jazakallah khair again for the book for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me too.